I'm Eleanor Brooks, 74 years old, retired school librarian, widow of a quiet mechanic named Walter, and mother to one son who used to promise me the moon when he was 12. Tonight, I stood on my own front porch with a hospital bracelet still biting my wrist and a rental car cooling behind me, and the key I'd carried for 37 years wouldn't turn in the lock because the lock was new, bright, and not mine. My son had forgotten to pick me up from the hospital after my surgery. I had driven myself home with stitches pulling under my sweater, and now my hand trembled on a stranger's deadbolt while the porch light I paid for flicked bugs into tiny sparks. That was the moment something in me stopped waiting to be loved right and started moving like a woman who remembers she owns the ground she's standing on. And then the door opened from the inside, but not for me. Who do you think walked out of my house with my son's spare key swinging on her finger? The day began with the soft beep of a discharge monitor and the nurse who smelled like peppermint saying, "Mrs. Brooks, your ride will be here any minute." I smiled because my son, Daniel, had texted the night before, "Got you, Mom. Noon sharp." He put a heart emoji like a Band-Aid over a bruise. Noon came and yawned, and the nurse peeked in again, her peppermint worry stronger, asking if I wanted them to call a cab. I said no. Daniel is just tied up at work. The clock turned 12:30 like a stubborn page in a book that won't lie flat, and I heard a hallway laugh that wasn't for me. At 1, the nurse pressed her lips together and said, "Let me get you a sandwich, sweetheart." I chewed with a mouth that tasted like old pennies and told myself not to take it personally, but every swallow felt like a tally mark. How long would you sit before you admitted something was broken? At 2:15, I did the one thing Walter always said made me dangerous. I acted as if I had options. I signed the discharge papers with a shaky flourish, pulled my cardigan around the bandage like armor, and asked the volunteer at the desk if the rental counter still ran a shuttle from the hospital. The girl blinked fast, then gave me a grin as if I'd told her a secret. "Yes, ma'am." Every half hour. In the reflection of the lobby glass, I looked like someone's favorite teacher trying to be brave for a fire drill. When the shuttle doors hissed open, I climbed aboard slow, counting each step like a prayer bead. Somewhere between the hospital and the rental lot, a thought as bright and mean as a thorn took root. If Daniel forgot me today, what else had he been forgetting while I was too polite to look? What would I find if I went home with all my eyes open for once? The rental clerk called me Miss Ellie in a way that rubbed my nerves raw, but he handed me the keys to a compact sedan with mirrors that showed every line on my face. "You sure you're okay to drive?" he asked, and I said, "I'm sure. I've been driving longer than you've been alive," which is a polite Southern way to say hush. I slid into the driver's seat and set both hands at 9 and 3, like I taught Daniel when he turned 16, memories of his sweaty palms and cocky grin cluttering the air. The first turn out of the lot hurt, so I hummed to keep from cussing, an old church tune about being carried when you can't walk. I wasn't carried. I carried myself past strip malls and a church sign that read "God is never late," and I muttered, "We'll see," because sometimes faith is telling God you noticed the clock. As the street names got familiar, so did a sick pitch in my stomach, a dog sense that home might not feel like mine. Have you ever dreaded a door you spent a life paying for? I pulled into my driveway, the one with the oil stains shaped like a broken heart from Walter's last truck, and everything looked mostly normal, the way a stranger at a reunion looks like somebody you almost remember. The porch swing creaked, the flower bed needed weeding, and the doormat said "Hello, sunshine," as if I were sunshine instead of a storm. But the lock, Lord, someone had installed a new lock as bright as a coin you'd never spend, and no one had told me the price. I put my old key in out of habit, and the key refused me like a church lady who knows your worst mistake. I was still staring at that little metal shrug when I heard laughter on the other side of the door, laughter with a slosh of glasses and a clink of ice. My son's voice, lower than it used to be, said, "Don't worry, Mom's in the hospital overnight." Overnight. He didn't know I'd decided to stop waiting. What do you do when the people you raise start talking about you like your luggage? Knuckles shaking, I knocked the way I used to knock on Daniel's bedroom door when he'd come home late, soft but steady, because I was determined to be the adult in the room even if I was the only one. The laughter fell into a hush, then footsteps approached like a verdict. The door swung wide, and a woman I didn't know leaned against my doorframe, wearing one of my silk robes. The blue one Walter bought me on his last birthday here, and her lipstick had bled into the cracks around her mouth from too much wine and not enough conscience. "Can I help you?" she asked, as if I were selling magazines. Behind her, my living room looked staged for someone else's life. Throw pillows arranged, candles burning, my wedding photo tilted toward the wall. My own home tilted away from me, and every carefully packed year I'd lived there slid against the boxes. Would you believe she called me by my first name like we were pals? "Eleanor," she said, dripping honey that smelled like a trap. "Daniel's at the store. He'll be right back." She held the spare key up like an earring, jangling it between two fingers, enjoying the shine. There was a time when I would have apologized for existing and backed away to cry in my car, but the ache under my stitches burned a clean red that lit up my spine. "And you are?" I asked, and she smiled with her teeth. "I'm Nina," she said. "We've been helping your son with the house." Helping. People love to dress stuffed up in service uniforms. I looked down at her bare feet on my welcome mat and wondered which box in my closet she'd pulled the robe from, and whether she'd left the lavender sachet inside like a tombstone. What kind of woman stands barefoot in another woman's robe and tells her to stand on the porch? There are moments of decision that feel like stepping onto thin ice, not sure if you're brave or stupid until you hear the crack. I straightened my shoulders, let the pain be a metronome, and said, "Move," in a voice I hadn't used since the year the school cut the library budget and I found a way to keep every book. She blinked, surprised that a woman who smells like hospital soap could sound like a door slamming. "Excuse me," she said, and I stepped forward. "I live here," I said, and putting one foot on that threshold felt like the first step after a long sleep. Nina shifted, calculations scurrying behind her eyes. "Look," she said, lowering her voice to something meant to make me feel old and silly. "Why don't you go rest at the motel? Daniel will explain everything." Explain everything. That's what children say when they already know they've done the thing they're about to excuse. Would you have pushed past her too? I didn't push. I did worse. I smiled. "Tell Daniel," I said, "that his mother is home." The word mother put the blood back in my name. I turned from the door. I wanted witnesses more than a scene, and walked down the steps, past the porch swing, to the driveway where my rental car waited like a quiet ally. From the glove compartment, I pulled out the envelope the hospital had given me, discharge papers rubber-banded together with my ID, insurance card, and the pen I'd signed with. I slid my ID back into my purse, tucked the insurance card where it belonged, and kept the pen. It felt like a wand for ordinary magic. Beside the rental keys on the passenger seat lay something else I'd carried all day without letting myself look. A stiff manila envelope Walter and I had updated the year before he died, back when we had a habit of preparing for storms on clear days. "Do you know what it holds, and how it might taste to open it with your teeth?" The envelope contained a copy of my will, and the attorney's card paper-clipped to the front, his number faded but readable. I'd been meaning to revisit the will, to adjust small gifts to church and to my sister's grandkids, a tidy chore I kept tucking behind grocery lists and medicine refills. Now, the tidy chore stood up and shouted. On the porch, Nina watched me with a cat's patience, expecting me to cry and leave. Instead, I sat in my driver's seat, turned on the dome light like a stage lamp, and dialed the number with a hand as steady as a metronome. When the paralegal answered, I said, "This is Mrs. Brooks. I need to update my will immediately." And my voice didn't wobble until the word immediately. She said, "Of course, Mrs. Brooks. Is everything all right?" And I answered the way a woman does when she's decided the answer will be yes whether or not it is. "Is this the moment you draw your own line in the dust?" While I waited on hold, Daniel's car rolled up, music thumping, headlights washing the porch in white. He stepped out with a paper sack of ice and a bottle peeking like a tongue, and for a second, one dangerous second, he looked 10 years old again, hair too long, smile too big, running with a kite. Then he saw me in the rental car, and his face rearranged itself the way you shove junk into a closet when company arrives. "Mom," he said, trying to make it sweet.
"Mom.
What are you doing here?" Behind him, Nina pulled his arm the way a woman pulls a lottery ticket out of the wind. The paralegal came back on the line and said they could see me first thing in the morning. "I can come tonight," I said, and she said, "Our attorney is still here. Some doors lock, some open if you knock like you mean it." Should I tell you the exact words I said, so you can borrow them when your courage needs a script? "Daniel," I said through the open car window, feeling the cool night touch the edges of my bandage, "you forgot me at the hospital." He started the dance, hands up, eyes soft, the "I'm sorry" shuffle I'd watched him practice since his teens. "Mom, it's been insane at work. I texted Nina to, you changed my locks," I said, and the dance stuttered. Security," he said, finding a word with a thin edge to hide behind. "We were going to, today was," he glanced at Nina, who stared back like a reflection he needed to be real. I let the silence grow large enough to show their outlines. Then I lifted the phone so the screen glowed between us. "I'm driving to my attorney's office," I said, "to change my will." The word will fell between us like a hammer that chooses the right nail. He flinched. "Mom, come on, don't be dramatic," he said, and somewhere inside me a soft thing that had lived off crumbs curled up and went to sleep forever. "What would it take for you to stop pleading and start deciding?" I put the car in gear, dome light still washing my hands in theater light, and backed out slow enough to make a point but fast enough to keep my courage from second-guessing me. Daniel followed to the curb, words spilling, explanations with no bones in them, promises like wet tissue. Nina called after him, but he didn't look back at her. For once, he looked at me the way a man looks at the person holding the deed to his comfort. I rolled down the window and said, "You can call me in the morning if you want to talk like my son. Tonight, I'm going to act like your mother." Then I drove into the night, the hospital bracelet whispering against the steering wheel, the manila envelope on the passenger seat like a second heartbeat. At the first red light, my eyes stung, not from sorrow but from the shock of being awake. When the light turned green, I watched the road change color and felt, truly felt, how power can return to old bones like rain. Want to know what I did the moment I walked into that law office? What clause I wrote with a steady hand and a quiet smile? If this story touched you, reminded you that self-respect has no age limit, and made you curious about what happens next, please like, comment, and subscribe. Tell me where you're watching from and what line you'd draw if you had to protect your peace. Your voice matters here, and Chapter 2 is coming with the truth that lights a match. The law office smelled like lemon oil and paper, the scent of decisions that don't need anyone's permission, and the receptionist blinked when I stepped in with my hospital bracelet flashing like a siren, because old women usually arrive in daylight, not in night clothes with determination blazing at their shoulders like epaulets, don't they? The paralegal, a woman in her 30s with a neat bun and eyes that looked like she kept emergency tissues in her desk, ushered me down a quiet hall where framed diplomas lined up like soldiers, and halfway to the conference room, my breath caught and I had to lean on the wall, suddenly aware of the throb marching under my bandage. Yet even my pain felt like a witness willing to testify. Do you know that feeling when your hurt points to the truth and demands action? "Mrs. Brooks," the attorney said as the door opened, his tie loosened, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbows the way men do when they mean to work and not just posture, and I could tell by the careful way he said my name that he had a mother he loved or a mother he missed, which are the two kinds of men who understand urgency without theatrics. Wouldn't you agree? I sat, palms flat on polished wood, and placed the manila envelope between us like a family Bible, and my voice came from lower than my throat. "My son changed the locks on my house while I was in the hospital," I said, watching his face for flinch or judgment and seeing neither, only the stillness of a person who knows the shape of greed even when it wears a familiar shirt. "Have you ever been grateful for a stranger's steady quiet?" He asked for facts the way surgeons ask for symptoms, direct, careful, already assembling a plan, and I gave them to him in a clean list. The missed pickup, the new locks, the woman in my robe, the way my wedding photo had been turned toward the wall like a child in trouble, and by the time I finished, my own voice sounded like a clerk reading a ledger of debts that had come due. Don't you hear debts sometimes, even in laughter? "We can do two things tonight," he said, sliding a legal pad toward me. The yellow bright is warning. We can prepare a new will with conditional language, and we can draft a directive that protects your residence from unauthorized occupation. And the way he said occupation made my skin prickle, because occupation is what we call it when a place is taken without your consent, which makes naming it the first step in taking it back. Does naming ever give you courage too? I told him I didn't want revenge. I wanted clarity, the kind that stops people from mistaking your kindness for vacancy, and he nodded, writing as if the pen were taking dictation from the part of me that had slept too long, and he asked, "Do you wish to alter beneficiaries?" And I surprised myself by not crying, only answering like I was balancing my checkbook. "Yes," I said, steady as a metronome. "Make gifts to the library fund and my sister's grandkids irrevocable, and place the house and primary accounts into a trust with a condition. My son receives nothing unless he can demonstrate consistent care and respect over time, because sometimes love requires fences so the garden can grow. Wouldn't you fence a garden from goats if the goats wore your last name?" He looked up then, not to judge, but to confirm that I understood the heft of the hammer I'd picked up, and I told him what Walter once told me when he taught me to use the socket wrench. "A tool is only dangerous when you don't respect it," I said, and the attorney smiled a small, professional smile that still, somehow, felt like blessing. "Haven't you found that even formal kindness can steady your hands?" We worked, the clock ticking like rain on a roof, the paralegal printing drafts that slid warm onto the table like fresh bread, and I read every line aloud because my ears catch lies my eyes sometimes miss. And when I reached the clause that required Daniel to attend counseling and complete an agreed plan to repair trust before any distribution, the room went quiet enough that I could hear my own intention click into place like a seat belt. Do you know that click that says, "Now we're secure"? I initialed margins, signed with my full name like a drumbeat. Eleanor Grace Brooks, each letter a plank I could stand on, and when we notarized, the paralegal's stamp thumped like a gavel that had finally found the right courtroom, and I held the final pages and felt an odd, gentle sorrow. Not because I was punishing my son, but because I had finally stopped letting him punish me. Have you ever mourned the habit of being small when you finally set it down? The attorney slid a folder toward me labeled Living Trust, Brooks, and inside was a map of the next days, a locksmith referral, a sheriff's office contact for a civil standby, a brief letter asserting my sole title and revoking any permission implied or otherwise to reside in the property, and he said, "You will not go alone," in a tone that made me feel like a person with a team again, which is something so many widows forget they're allowed to have. Don't you think we all deserve a team when the ground starts to tilt? Outside, the parking lot hummed with the soft electric loneliness of late offices, and when I slid behind the wheel, the hospital bracelet whispered against the steering wheel again, a thin paper shiver that now sounded less like vulnerability and more like a ribbon tied to a key so you don't lose it, and I realized I had found the key I needed. Not metal, but resolve. Do you know the relief of finding a key that opens you? I didn't drive home. Not yet. I drove to the 24-hour pharmacy and bought a cheap flip phone with a new number, because sometimes the first defense against manipulation is a different ringtone, and when the clerk asked for the name to activate, I said Eleanor G., and felt oddly teenaged, like I'd just invented an alias for an adventure. Have you ever felt younger when you finally chose yourself? Back in the car, my regular phone pulsed with messages. 8 from Daniel, 3 from unknown numbers that I suspected were Nina's friends or relatives, 1 from the church lady who forwards prayer chains like chainsaws, and I tapped none of them because tonight's discipline was simple, no explaining to people committed to misunderstanding me. Can you imagine how many arguments would vanish if you refused to audition for people's forgiveness? I texted Daniel one sentence from the new number. "I'll talk tomorrow. Bring your keys and your honesty." And then I turned both phones off. A Sabbath I gifted myself, and I checked into a modest motel with a bedspread pattern that looked like it had survived 6 presidential terms, and when the clerk said, "Do you need help with your bags?" I almost said, "No, thank you. I'm only carrying the future," which would have sounded dramatic and a little unhinged. Don't you ever want to say the thing your heart whispers even when your mouth chooses manners? Sleep came in patches, stitched by the hum of the ice machine and the hiss of the bathroom fan, and in the thin dark hour that doesn't belong to yesterday or tomorrow, I dreamed Walter standing at the foot of the bed with his hands in his pockets, The way he stood when he'd finished a job and was waiting for me to notice, and he said nothing, just tipped his chin like a man proud of a freshly tuned engine. And I woke with tears drying salt on my cheeks. Do you believe the dead sometimes come by to say, keep going, without any words at all? At 7 a.m., sunlight slid through the motel curtains like a note slid under a door, and I dressed in the same clothes but felt different in them. The way soup tastes better the second day because everything has had time to become itself, and I pinned my hair back, checked my bandage, and practiced 2 sentences in the mirror. This is my home, and you are leaving now, because sometimes courage arrives in declarative mood. Could you practice a sentence in the mirror today just to hear yourself sound sure? At 8, I met the locksmith the attorney recommended, a calm woman named Teresa with forearms that told me she could lift a safe if the safe gave her attitude, and she shook my hand like an agreement and said, "We'll do this by the book, sheriff present, paperwork in hand." And my gratitude felt like a coin clicking into the right slot, because professionalism is a kind of grace that doesn't require flowers. Don't you love when competence feels like kindness? We drove in separate cars to the sheriff's substation, where a deputy named Alvarez read the letter twice, asked 2 precise questions, then nodded and said, "We'll be there in 10. And in that moment I understood why law is called an arm. The reach of it, the cover of it, the way it can lift or restrain. And I felt covered for the first time in a long time. Have you ever realized that asking for help is not weakness but logistics? We rolled up to my house like a small procession, Teresa's van, Deputy Alvarez's cruiser, my rental with the trust folder riding shotgun, and the porch looked exactly as it had the night before, except now I was arriving with daylight and documents, which changes everything, doesn't it? Even before a word is spoken? Nina opened the door before we knocked, wearing my bathrobe again, as if repetition could turn wrong into custom, and when she saw the deputy, she tried a smile that had worked on men with less training, but Alvarez wore the kind of neutrality that closes doors on manipulation, and he said, "Ma'am, we're here to supervise a lawful re-entry by the homeowner." And she blinked like someone who just realized the party she planned was taking place on someone else's property. Do you know that blink? When entitlement meets boundary. Daniel stumbled into view behind her, unshaven, barefoot, guilt smelling like last night's whiskey, and he started with my name, Mom, which is a word that used to open me like a music box, but today it landed with a small, dull clink, and he said, "There's a misunderstanding." And Alvarez lifted a hand, palm steady, and said, "Sir, this will go quickly if you listen." And in that instant, I could almost see the boy he'd been standing behind the man he'd become. Couldn't you just cry? For the ways good boys get lost inside grown men who forget themselves? Teresa set down her toolkit and looked to me, professional and patient, and I nodded, handing her the letter and my ID, and she got to work, the turn of her screwdriver answering the lie the lock tried to tell, and metal yielded to purpose with a sound like a stubborn old argument finally letting go. Have you ever felt a house breathe when the right key touches it? When the deadbolt loosened, we stepped into air that smelled faintly of my lavender cleaner. My cleaner, not theirs, and I saw my living room with all my eyes. The cushioned dent where Nina's hips had been, the ring on the coffee table from a glass set down without a coaster, the wedding photo still face down, and, beside it, a stack of mail slit open with someone else's impatience, and a heat rose in me that wasn't rage so much as clarity. Because clarity burns hot and clean, doesn't it? "Here's what's going to happen," I said, voice steady enough to serve tea on. "You have 1 hour to pack what you brought into my home and to leave." And Daniel made a sound like a hinge that needs oil, and said, "Mom, please, it's not what it looks like." And I answered him gently because gentleness is a power tool when you know how to hold it. It is exactly what it looks like, son, and it's also what it feels like to me. Which is a sentence I wish I'd learned sooner, could you? Imagine how many years we'd save if we trusted our own eyes and feelings the first time. Alvarez checked his watch and said, 1 hour, and Nina bristled, hissed, "You can't do this." And I looked at her the way librarians look at loud teenagers, with an affection for their eventual growth that does not include allowing nonsense in the reading room, and I said, "You are a guest of my son's poor judgment, not a tenant." And even Alvarez's mouth twitched like he'd file that phrase for later. Don't you love it when the right words arrive exactly on time? They packed badly, People who take what isn't theirs never pack, as if they'll have to carry it far. And while they moved, I went room to room reclaiming small altars. My wedding photo upright, the bowl of keys sorted, the kitchen timer returned to its hook, and in my bedroom I paused at the blue robe's empty hanger, then chose from the closet the gray cardigan Walter used to call my armor, and I put it on like a flag that means home. Can a sweater be a banner you plant? At minute 59, Nina lugged a tote to the door and turned as if to stake a final claim, a slow gaze over furniture she'd barely learned the names of, and she said, "You're making a mistake," and I answered softly, "I've made many, this isn't one." And Alvarez opened the door and stepped aside with the little bow of a man who honors boundaries because he sees how hard it is to rebuild them. Have you ever been grateful for small ceremonies held by strangers? Daniel lingered, the last box at his feet like a stubborn thought, and he said, "Mom, I'm sorry," and I nodded, not in forgiveness yet, but in recognition. A start is not a finish, and sorry isn't a bridge until you build it plank by plank with changed behavior, and I told him so. Kinder than he deserved and exactly as kind as I deserve to be. "I will not discuss this here," I said. "You can meet me tomorrow at noon at Pastor Helen's office. We will have a witness to truth, because some conversations need a referee so the rules hold. Don't you wish we used referees more in family games?" After the door closed, silence rose up like a tide that washed crumbs of chaos into corners I could reach, and Teresa installed the new lock, placing a spare key and a code in my palm, and said, "Call me if anyone touches these," and Alvarez gave me a card with a number written on the back, his direct line, and said, "You did the right thing," and both of them left me in a house that was mine again, but also a house I would never pretend was the same, because some storms change the pain even if the walls still stand. Have you stood in a quiet room and heard the newness creak? I made tea, because boiling water is the oldest magic I know, and sat at the kitchen table where Walter had once measured bolts and Daniel had learned fractions with cookies, and I wrote a list titled repairs in block letters. Change locks, done. Reset alarm, call window company, schedule counselor, meet pastor, review accounts, and at the bottom I wrote in cursive like a prayer, "Remember you are allowed to be safe. Do you ever write notes to the future you, so she doesn't forget what this you survived?" By noon, the house felt swept of strangers even though the dust still held their shapes, and I lay down on the couch with a throw blanket that smelled like clean linen and naps, and I slept a clean hour, the kind that earns dreamless mercy, and woke to the gentle clatter of mail through the slot. On top, in a white envelope with Daniel's messy scrawl, I found a note pushed from the porch. "Mom, please don't cut me out. I can explain. Meet me sooner." And my hands steadied not from softness, but from remembering I had already given him where and when and how to be heard. Can you feel how boundaries turn begging into schedules? I set his note by my tea and looked at the framed photo of Walter and me at the county fair, his cap tilted, my smile big enough to hold a July sky, and I said aloud, "Because some promises require witnesses even if the witness is a memory, I will not be less so that others can be more." And the house seemed to settle, with sighing like a friend leaning back into a couch cushion it recognizes. Do you ever speak vows to empty rooms until they echo back as structure? At 5:30, just as the sun laid a gold bar across the living room floor, my flip phone, the new number no one had but the people I chose, buzzed with a call from Pastor Helen, her voice strong as a hymn and soft as a hand on the shoulder, saying she could meet tomorrow and would keep a log, and she asked, "Do you want anyone else present?" And I thought of names: lawyer, Teresa, Deputy Alvarez. But the name that settled in my chest was smaller and fiercer. I wanted the teenage girl I used to be who thought love meant swallowing her own voice, and I said, "I'll be bringing Eleanor. That will be enough." Do you know the quiet electricity of deciding that you are, at last, good company? I slept in my own bed that night, the window cracked to let in September and the old maples whisper, and I held the new keys in my palm until they warmed, and when I set them on the nightstand, they glowed faintly in the dark like small moons faithful enough to wax again, and just before sleep closed the day, I heard the mailbox clatter once more. Too late for a carrier, which meant a hand had delivered something in the dark, and I lay still, listening for footsteps that didn't come. Would you get up to check? Or would you wait for morning and sunlight and a witness to read what might already be waiting to burn? Morning came with a thin ribbon of sunlight laid across my dresser like a bookmark, and I opened my eyes to the small, faithful sounds of my own house, pipes clearing their throats, the maple outside tapping at the window. Then I remembered the metal cough of the mailbox after midnight and felt the day harden around a question the way sugar turns to glass on a hot spoon. Don't you know that feeling when the first breath of morning already carries the weight of an answer you didn't ask to hear? I put my robe on the way a soldier puts on a coat, careful, purposeful, and walked down the hall, each floorboard greeting me by name as if to report for duty, and on the entry rug lay a single white envelope, no stamp, no return address, my name written in a hand that had learned how to behave in front of teachers but never learned how to tell the truth at home. Because my son's letters always lean to the right like they were in a hurry to justify themselves. Have you ever recognized a person just by the slant of what they demand from you? I did not open it on the threshold. I carried it to the kitchen table where Walter and I once balanced bills with nickels in an old mason jar, and where Daniel had learned fractions with oatmeal cookies we broke and shared, and I set the kettle on, because hot water is my prelude to decisions, and only when the whistle started did I slit the envelope with a butter knife, as if I were unsealing a room where something had spoiled. Can you hear the difference between paper tearing for a birthday and paper tearing for a fight? Inside was not a letter but a photocopy, a durable power of attorney, dated 3 weeks ago, my name typed neat as a tombstone inscription, granting Daniel broad authority to manage the affairs and assets of Eleanor G. Brooks, and below it a signature that tried hard to be mine but lacked the hitch in the loop of my G, a hitch I've had since 5th grade, when I broke a pinky on the playground slide. And my stomach turned the way a boat turns just as a storm reaches it. Have you ever watched someone forge not just your name but your future on a sheet that pretends to be mercy? There was a sticky note over the lower margin, neat block letters from Nina's tidy, teacher-pleasing hand. We did this to help with hospital paperwork. You are so tired, call us and we can explain love. And the love felt like a pothole covered with a paper napkin, thin and dangerous, and I wanted to fling the whole thing into the sink and drown it under boiling water, but the adult in me is a librarian still. You keep the evidence, you tag it, you file it for the right hour, which is to say, the hour when it will tell the truth without any makeup. Do you save things even when they make your hands shake? I photographed the document front and back, sent it to my attorney with a single sentence, received on my doorstep overnight, not mine, and then I brewed the tea, even though my mouth had gone to chalk, because ceremony keeps panic from eating the furniture, and while the leaves steeped, I wrote 2 sentences on a yellow pad in block letters. My body is mine. My name is mine, and I underlined the second one until the paper thinned, because sometimes you have to see the line to stop letting people drag you over it. Will you write your own sentence today and pin it where the light can read it? By 10, I had changed into a sensible blue dress, pinned my hair back, and checked my bandage. Pain traveled under the skin like a small, stubborn river. But pain is not a vote unless you give it one, and I placed the photocopy in a zippered pouch with the trust papers and slid the pouch into my handbag, the way a woman carries both her lunch and her leverage, and I looked up at Walter's photograph on the mantel and said, "Watch." Because the living sometimes need permission from the dead too. Act like they're alive. Have you ever asked a picture to be your witness because it was your witness when the world was kinder? I arrived at Pastor Helen's office 5 minutes early, because early is respect, and her administrative assistant, Ruth, a woman with bracelets that sounded like a quiet rain, led me into a small room with a couch that had held more truth than most courtrooms, and a box of tissues sat ready like a polite usher, though I planned to leave them untouched if I could, since I wanted my tears to be witnesses, not actors. Do you ever ration your crying so it tells the truth instead of making you forget it? Pastor Helen came in with that calm that looks like still water and is actually a deep current, and she took my hands and said, "Eleanor," in a tone that made my name sound like a vow, and I handed her the photocopy and watched a dark river move behind her eyes, and she said, "We will be clear, we will be kind, we will be firm," which is the only order of operations I trust anymore. Wouldn't you let a person like that hold your porch light while you turned your lock? Daniel arrived late, which is the cheapest form of power some people ever learn, and when he stepped through the door, he did a double take at seeing me seated upright, purse closed, notes in order, as if he had expected to meet ruins and found a renovation crew, and he said, "Mom, which used to feel like a warm hand on my shoulder and now felt like an address he wasn't licensed to use. And he took the chair across from me, his knee bouncing out a rhythm you could set a metronome to. Have you ever watched a grown man try to hide from his own heartbeat? He opened with the script he's carried since he was 17. Apology as sedative. I'm sorry, I messed up. Work has been brutal. And Pastor Helen lifted a hand, palm a quiet stop sign, and said, let's start with the truth you both agree on. And I said, he changed my locks while I was in the hospital. And Daniel said, temporarily, for security. And I said, without telling me. And he dropped his eyes, because even when you sell your mother a lie, your eyes remember how to tell the truth. Don't you rely on eyes when mouths waste your time? I slid the photocopy across the table like a postcard from a country I refused to visit, and Daniel paled the way people do when their consequence catches up to their premise, and he said, too fast. Mom, this was just Nina thought. Look, you were groggy. We were trying to streamline things. And I leaned forward, the bone memory of a librarian returning noisy boys to the whispered alphabet, and said, say the words, power over your mother, and feel how they taste. Because sometimes the cure for euphemism is accuracy. Will you try naming the thing plainly today and see who survives the sentence? Pastor Helen took notes on a legal pad, her pen quiet as she drew a square and wrote trust in the middle, arrows branching to house, accounts, dignity, and she asked Daniel to explain the locks and the document in simple terms a child could understand. And after a minute of stammering, he said, I thought if I got ahead of things, I could ensure stability. And I said, for home. And he didn't answer because the truth in that room had begun to take up the space fear used to occupy. Have you ever watched truth pull its chair up and make everyone scoot? Daniel, Pastor Helen said, voice not unkind, your mother is alive, competent, and most certainly present. And she tapped the word dignity in the box labeled trust like a bell, and the ringing in my chest felt like something old standing up straighter. And she continued, your job is to repair what you broke, not to apply bandages that hide your breaking. And he flinched at the word broke the way people flinch when they hear a mirror shatter in another room. Do you feel your own shards when someone names them? I told him the new terms, the trust, the counseling requirement, the conditionality on any inheritance. And for a minute he tried to laugh, the performative, helpless sort that says I'm still a boy, so you can't really expect anything of me. But it died halfway out of his mouth when he saw I wasn't auditioning for the role of his mother who will fall apart, and he said, how could you do this to me? And I said, I am doing this for me. Because there are rooms where the preposition is the difference between a wound and a suture. Will you check the prepositions in your life and see who they rescue? His phone vibrated. He glanced. Nina's name flashed. Pastor Helen said gently, turn it off. And he did, a small miracle, and then he looked at me, not as a queen mother or an ATM or a forgiving machine, but as a woman who knew how to sign her own name and meant it, and he said, smaller, I'm scared, and my heart, God help me, took one step toward him, because I remember a boy who once cried when he broke the wing off a paper crane and begged me to teach him how to fold it back, but fear is not a permission slip to steal, and I said, I am frightened too, and I am still responsible for me. Which is a sentence that tastes like medicine and works like it too. Can you speak medicine to someone who wants sugar? We agreed on a plan we could write down without adjectives. He would return the spare keys. He would move to his own apartment by week's end. He would begin counseling with the man Pastor Helen recommended. He would not enter my home without express invitation, and we would speak on Sundays with a witness present until further notice. And when he signed the page with a shaky hand, I felt a tiny release in the room. The way a jar gives when the lid finally turns. Have you felt how relief sounds? Like a small click rather than a symphony? We stood. We prayed. Nothing long. Just the kind of prayer that hangs like a plumb line from a high beam and tells you whether things are true. And as we walked out, my phone hummed. A text from the attorney. Report filed regarding forged document. Hold for instructions, and I felt safety stretch its arms over my shoulders like a friend's jacket on a cold night, and I was ready to go home and make soup and maybe put my feet up with a mystery novel. Ordinary things that taste like victory when you've spent days eating crisis. Doesn't soup turn into a parade when you've been starving for calm? Daniel and I paused at the curb. The noon sun drew hard shadows that looked like underlines beneath everything we'd said. He tried to meet my eyes and managed it halfway. "I'll bring the keys tonight," he said. "Bring them now," I answered, and to his credit he nodded and hustled to his car to fetch them, and while I waited, a sedan rolled up too fast, the windows sliding down as if it were a tongue getting ready to say something sharp. And Nina leaned across the passenger seat, sunglasses on, jaw set, and hissed, "You think you won because you have a pastor and a paper. Watch me." And my hands went still at my sides, because there are women who don't know they've already lost until silence refuses to play. But then she tossed something into the gutter and sped off. Would you have chased, or would you have looked down to see what the gutter had to say? Daniel came back with the keys. We exchanged metal without touching hands. He said, "I'll be in touch," and I didn't bless or punish the sentence. I just nodded and turned toward my car, and only then did I walk to the gutter, where a small black flash drive lay like a beetle playing dead, and I bent, slow, careful, and picked it up with a tissue from my purse, because I know enough crime novels to know fingerprints aren't metaphors, and I held it up to the light, small, ordinary, loaded, and felt a new kind of question bloom in my ribs, the kind that opens doors into rooms you didn't even know were built inside your house. Do you feel what I felt? The click of a lock you haven't changed yet? Back at home, I placed the flash drive on a ceramic dish the color of storm clouds, stared at it the way sailors stare at barometers, and called my attorney before curiosity could talk me into plugging a stranger into my old computer, and he said, "Bring it in, we'll image it safely." And I slipped it into a clean envelope, wrote the date and time on the front, and set my purse by the door. Because some errands can wait, and some should be run while the evidence is still warm. Can you tell which is which inside your own day? I went to the sink to wash a pair, the way widows break tense hours into edible pieces, and through the window I saw Teresa's Van Cruz slowly past, her hand lifting in a small salute before she turned the corner, and I realized how many names I could call now when the ground tilts. Teresa, Alvarez, Helen, Reynolds the attorney. And the knowledge sat in me like a new organ I didn't know I needed until it started doing its quiet work. Don't you wish they taught girls to build teams the way they teach boys to build fires? The kettle clicked off again, a second cup for courage, and just as the steam curled, my front door rattled, not with a key but with a fist, 3 hard knocks, then a pause, then 3 more, a pattern that thought it owned my fear, and I carried my spine and my phone to the peephole, and what I saw turned my mouth dry. A man in a dark suit, badge at his belt, another behind him, their faces official, unreadable, and when I opened the door to the safety chain, the first one held up a folded paper and said, "Miss Brooks, we have a warrant to search the premises in connection with a financial exploitation complaint," and the kettle hissed behind me like a snake that couldn't get between us, and for one foolish second, I thought of the flash drive on the dish, and the photocopy in my bag, and Daniel's thin apology sitting beside Pastor Helen's thick courage, and the room leaned, small, then righted itself as a new chapter walked up my porch steps wearing the state's shoes. What would you do if the law arrived carrying both your rescue and your ruin in the same hand? The first officer stood with his boot heel on the sun-faded edge of my doormat, the paper lifted just high enough for me to see the judge's seal, while the second scanned the street like trouble might be jogging in our direction, and the kettle behind me clicked itself off, as if even appliances know when to keep quiet. Do you know that hell-breath moment when the rules of your life flutter like a loose page and you wonder which law is about to be read over you? "Ma'am, we need to come in," the lead said, Officer Pike, his name stitched neat over a chest that didn't need to puff to be obeyed, and I slid the safety chain free, mind speaking to memory the way a librarian speaks to a microfilm machine. Steady, exact, purposeful, because panic wastes time, and I was done donating. Haven't you felt that pivot where fear is a bad employee you finally fire? Before you do, I'll need your credentials and a copy of the warrant scope, I answered, and the part of me that once cataloged 1004 biographies sat upright and took notes while my hands stayed calm at my sides. Because competence is a kind of prayer you do with your spine. Have you ever felt taller just from asking for the paperwork you're allowed to see? He handed me a copy, Financial Exploitation of a Vulnerable Adult, the words stacked like a pile of bricks someone else intended to wall me in with, and I felt a cold bloom under my bandage that wasn't physical so much as ancestral. The the way women in my family must have felt when the men they fed tried to sell their chairs from under them. But even cold can be a clarifier if you let it. Do you know how winter can teach you which windows leak? Who filed the complaint? I asked, eyes moving line by line, finger tracing the paragraphs like I was following a recipe I needed to turn inside out, and Pike said, "That's sealed pending investigation," which I translated as Nina with Daniel's help, because I can recognize the cologne of a bad idea, even when it wears legal deodorant. Can't you smell it too? Search is limited to financial records and electronic media. Pike continued, voice even, computers, external drives, correspondence, bank statements, anything germane, and the second officer, Miller, tucked a small camera to his vest and clicked it on, an eye that wouldn't blink or forget, and I did what Walter taught me when a machine makes a noise you don't understand. I made sure my own noise was the clearest thing in the room, because clarity is the oil of hard gears. Would you study yourself that way if your hallway's suddenly filled with badges? Then come in, I said, opening the door fully, and we will do this clean. And their boots stepped onto my wood floor with the reluctant respect of people entering a chapel, and I felt my house tighten and then straighten like a girl bracing for roll call. The photographs on the wall watching as if they'd dish if the frames could speak, and I whispered, "You may look," to the rooms that had spent a night remembering who they belonged to. Have you ever asked your home to hold its line with you? While Pike read a set of rights I could have recited with him, I thumbed my new flip phone alive, quiet, small, and texted 3 words to Reynolds, my attorney, Warren at house, and 1 to Pastor Helen, police here now, then called Deputy Alvarez, whose neutrality the day before had impressed me as the kind that pays for its own coffee, and he said, "I'm nearby." As if God sometimes keeps good men in reserve for moments when paper tries to push you. Don't you love when competence answers the phone on the first ring? I placed the dish with the black flash drive on the kitchen counter like an exhibit, labeled the envelope with the date and time again, and told Officer Pike, "I have something you'll want." Picked up with a tissue, prints fresh only if they're hers, and his eyebrow did a small, appreciative hitch, the micro-expression of a man whose day just shifted from paperwork to purpose. Haven't you learned to read those tiny faces that turn the plot? He gloved, bagged the drive, labeled it precisely while Miller logged locations and times, and I breathed easier at the ritual of it. The way chain of custody, when performed by believers, feels like truth standing up straight, then offered the photocopy of the forged power of attorney like a second chorus, and Pike frowned in a way that rearranged the lines around his eyes into a map of worry, which is another kind of ally. Can you feel when the state's face turns from suspicion to attention? Miller asked for electronic devices. I gestured to the old desktop in the study, to the tiny tablet I used for recipes, to the shoebox of retired flip phones I kept out of habit and history, and while they cataloged, I placed a pot on the stove and sliced carrots, because soup is how my people spell sanity, and I told myself, you are feeding this moment so it doesn't eat you. Have you ever cooked just to keep your hands from following your fear? Alvarez arrived 10 minutes later, boots quiet as reassurance, and he tipped his chin to me like we'd kept each other's houses before, then read the warrant himself without any performative throat clearing, and something inside me loosened when his gaze sharpened at the forged document and the bag drive, because a good eye in a uniform is like an old neighbor with a spare key. Haven't you blessed such neighbors under your breath? Ms. Brooks is cooperating fully, Pike said to Alvarez with a professionalism that washed the room in detergent, and I thought, let professionalism be the soap that keeps the grease from catching fire, because all I wanted was for this to be a kitchen and not a battlefield, unless a battlefield was required, and if it was, I wanted the right soldiers. Do you choose your battles based on whether the utensils nearby can become tools? Nina's perfume arrived before her tires, a sugary fog that has always reminded me of a fairground where rigged games play cheerful music, and a beep on a key fob chirped in my driveway like gossip clearing its throat, and she strode to my porch in oversized sunglasses and a knit set too tidy for noon, with a lawyer trailing her, slick hair, portable arrogance, and I thought, of course, the costume department never sleeps in a bad play. Do you feel how props announce the scene change before actors open their mouths? You can't search without me present. I'm the caregiver, she declared, holding her phone high like a torch with no fire in it, and Pike didn't even turn his head all the way when he said, doors were opened by the homeowner pursuant to a warrant, and Alvarez added, mild as rain, and there is no registered caregiver on file, which made her lawyer swallow his next line whole. And I thanked whatever angels manage municipal records for working in pencil and erasers. Don't you believe in the unsung clerks who hold back floods with staplers? Her eyes skimmed the kitchen and landed on me with a smile that could curdle cream, and she said, "Eleanor, sweetheart, you should have called. We were about to bring you groceries." And I answered with a sentence I'd rehearsed in the mirror until it belonged to my throat. "Do not speak to me unless it is through these officers or my attorney." And the word attorney settled between us like a friendly bulldog on a porch. Have you ever felt the way a single boundary can leash a whole afternoon? Reynolds walked in then. Ty nodded, mind already plugging holes I couldn't see, and greeted the officers by name in the way men do when they bump into each other at professional funerals, and the room shifted again, like a boat settling when someone sits in the right place, and he said quietly to me, "We will let the search proceed. We have more to gain than to lose." And I thought of Walter telling me to let an engine run for a minute after you change the oil, because patience is part of the repair. Do you trust a minute more when someone who knows machines tells you to wait? Pike asked if there was a safe. I nodded and led them to the closet where Walter had installed a small fireproof box behind painting wire and common sense, and I spun the dial, hands remembering what grief had never managed to erase, and inside lay the old titles, the deed, the birth certificates, my marriage license, the paper bones of a life, and I passed them over one by one, cataloging aloud dates and names like a docent in a museum where every display case had once been a backyard. Do you ever narrate your own archives to prove to yourself you're real? When they reached my desk, Miller paused at a stack of open mail, the slit envelopes, the ragged edges, and I watched him photograph the pile before he lifted a single letter, and I prayed a small, plain prayer that the camera could see what memory had tried to swallow. Lines torn in a hurry, corners bent like a mouth biting itself, fingerprints that weren't mine, or were mine but sweaty with someone else's supervision. And I thought of the night I woke to find the living room light on and dismissed it as a neighbor's porch, and I felt the old shame for times I had chosen peace over proof. Have you forgiven yourself for buying quiet with your own voice? At the table, Nina whispered to her lawyer and glanced at the bagged flash drive as if she'd thrown a snake and expected it to bite me, not her, and Reynolds leaned in and murmured, "We'll request to mirror anything seized. You will be fully informed," and I nodded, grateful that night now had multiple flashlights, because darkness isn't brave. It's merely undisputed until someone finds batteries. Haven't batteries saved your evening when the power went out and you remembered where you keep them? Miller called Pike into the study. They huddled over the desktop. The screen reflected in their eyes. Alvarez joined them with the posture of a man who knows not to breathe loudly when truth is taking delicate steps, and I stayed in the kitchen with my soup and my study because I have learned the discipline of not hovering over men with jobs. They work better when you give them the space to surprise you with competence. Could you step back from a thing long enough to let the right person do it? "Miss Brooks," Pike called after a minute, voice different, lower, weight on it, and I wiped my hands, walked down the hall as if it were the aisle in a church where someone had finally decided to tell the truth at the microphone, and he pointed to the screen where a folder sat open, scans, and inside it, subfolders labeled with dates and one named signature practice, Nina, Daniel, and I felt the world tilt in a new direction. The kind that writes a picture you didn't realize was crooked. Can you feel when a name on a file is a confession because it was never meant to be read by the person it betrays? Miller clicked. The first image filled the monitor. A page of my name written 20 times, then 30, looped and labored. The G wrong in every one until it wasn't. The hitch faked through repetition. The ink darker where the hand pressed too hard on guilt, and I pressed a palm to the desk because even triumph makes old knees remember stairs, and I whispered, "That's my broken pinky," like magic words that unlock sleeping spells. Don't you marvel when your childhood injury becomes an adult's perjury test? Another file opened. Video this time. The shaky angle of a phone propped against a book, Nina coaching. "Softer on the loop, baby." Eleanor makes it softer. Daniel muttering, "Like this?" The date stamped 3 weeks back, the same week on the forged power, and even through my shock a part of me noted the book they'd propped the phone on, Walter's old Chilton manual. And I wanted to laugh and weep at once because thieves never know how much they tell on themselves. Have you seen how arrogance is a terrible housekeeper that leaves evidence everywhere? Pike exhaled in that precise way that means a report just got easier to write, and Alvarez said, almost tenderly, Miss Brooks, will you formally attest to the distinctiveness of your signature hitch? And I nodded, mouth dry, heart steady, and Reynolds, bless his legal soul, was already drafting the affidavit on his tablet, stylus scratching like a satisfied cricket. And I realized that sometimes justice is not a trumpet but a series of quiet instruments playing in tune. Do you lean closer when the music is small but exact? Nina's lawyer pushed to his feet then, voice pitched to objection even though no courtroom had been convened. We dispute authenticity. This could be fabricated, chain of custody. And Pike, without looking away from a screen, said, sit down, counselor. In a tone I suspect he keeps on a high shelf for special occasions, and Nina crossed her arms, sunglasses still on inside. Which is how some people try to keep their eyes from testifying. Have you noticed that truth always finds a window even when curtains come from expensive stores? The soup simmered, the house held, the officers worked, and then Daniel's car crawled past the window like a dog that knows the yard has been refenced, and he parked at the curb instead of the driveway because even the concrete had learned to tell the difference between invitation and trespass, and he stepped out, hair damp, eyes wide, and saw the cruiser and Teresa's van driving by again, a coincidence that felt like choreography. And he hesitated on the sidewalk, the way boys do before they confess or run. Which would you have done if your own plot had turned on you in daylight? Alvarez met him at the path, explained the warrant, the evidence, the presence of counsel. Daniel looked at me over Alvarez's shoulder with a plea that tried to be a bridge built out of crumbs, and I maintained my new discipline. No explanations offered to mouths still chewing old lies, and turned my attention back to Pike, who was labeling yet another file. Draft, QITCLAM, Eleanor T.O. Daniel. And my chest went cold and hot at once, like stepping from shade into sun and back, because there it was. The deed they had been practicing for. Have you ever seen the weapon someone meant to use on you before they could lift it? Ms. Brooks, Reynolds said softly, this is more than enough to counter the original complaint. We'll move to dismiss and to file our own if you wish. And I said, I wish to protect what is mine and to save what can still be saved, which is not a paradox when you've lived as long as I have. It's simply a list with 2 columns, boundaries and mercy. And I began to fill it with the precision of a woman who used to run circulation reports on paper slips and knows how to tally late fees without hating the children who forgot their books. Do you keep 2 columns too when love and safety share a page? The search concluded in measured steps, devices bagged, receipts signed. Reynolds retained images. Alvarez wrote a supplemental note that read, in part, in my hearing, homeowner cooperative. Initial accusation appears to lack foundation. Evidence of forgery captured. And Nina's mouth flattened into a pale ribbon as if blood itself had decided to stop volunteering for her performance. And her lawyer herded her toward the door with whispered instructions that sounded like a rain stick with no water left inside. Haven't you seen advice turn empty in real time? Pike paused at the threshold, copy of the warrant folded back to a blank side, and said, we may be in touch again. In the meantime, consider this house under watch. And I nodded, not quite crying, exactly breathing, and when the door closed behind them, silence rose like bread, warm and inevitable, and I stood in my own kitchen and ladled soup into a bowl big enough to feed a story, because even victorious mornings leave you hungry. Don't you eat better when your name has been returned to you? Daniel lingered on the walkway after the cruisers left, hands buried in his pockets, boy shoulders trying to find themselves under man clothes, and he said without moving closer, Mom, I'll do the counseling, and the part of me that had been a mother longer than I had been anything else raised an eyebrow and sighed and answered, do it for you, not for my will. And he nodded once, as if the difference had finally landed like mail addressed to the right house. Have you learned the hard way that the reason matters more than the ritual? Reynolds packed his briefcase, touched my elbow in a manner fatherly but not patronizing, and said, I'll have filings on your desk by morning. And Pastor Helen texted in that exact moment, I'm at your porch if you want prayer that tastes like water. And I laughed. a single bark that surprised me with its brightness, and wrote back, "Come in, because some doors need to be opened on purpose when other doors have been opened by papers." And she swept in with her steady and put her palms on my kitchen table and asked, "What do you need?" And for once I did not answer with a poem. I answered with a list. "Are you ready to answer your next what do you need?" Without flinching, we sat as the afternoon leaned toward gold, Herbert the mailman's shadow sliding across my window like a loyal sundial, and Pastor Helen suggested we write a covenant. What I would do when fear tried to make my phone finger stupid, what Daniel must do to cross the small bridge I was willing to build, what consequences would arrive if either of us let the old manipulators back in to MC our dinners. And I wrote in block letters again, because today I wanted my future legible even to my frightened self. Can you picture your name on a covenant you keep with your own courage? We had just written the last line, no more secrets, only schedules. No more threats, only terms. When my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize and a tone that made my shoulder blades inch closer together, and I answered because bravery sometimes picks up even when caller ID goes blank, and a voice said, crisp, official, "Ms. Brooks, this is Denise Foster with Adult Protective Services. I'm calling regarding a report on your well-being. We'd like to visit today to confirm you are safe and competent." And I said, evenly, "You are welcome. Bring your form. Bring your eyes, bring your honesty, because I had mine already. Aren't you curious to see what face the system will wear when it meets the evidence you just watched come to light?" 5 minutes later, my neighbor Mr. Whitaker shuffled over with his plaid cap and his doorbell app open, saying, "Miss Eleanor, I don't mean to meddle, but my camera caught something last night. Woman in a robe dropped an envelope at your door at 12:41 a.m. Want me to share?" And Pastor Helen and I looked at each other the way women look when a puzzle piece rolls under the couch and finds its way back to the rug, and I said, "Yes, please," and he airdropped the clip, and there she was, Nino in my robe, barefoot on my porch, paper in hand, time-stamped like a confession that signed itself. Do you feel the satisfying weight of a receipt arriving exactly when your hands are empty? I sent the clip to Reynolds with the subject line Exhibit B. I texted Alvarez with a thank you and an attachment. I printed 2 copies because paper, when clean, is a sword, and as the printer hummed, soup bowls drying, sunlight moving, I thought for one dangerous moment we had reached the crest, that the worst had broken, that all I had to do now was keep my appointments and my breath. But danger loves a woman who thinks a page has fully turned, doesn't it? The officer from APS knocked right at 3, smile sincere, clipboard real, eyes that already liked me because kitchens have a way of testifying on your behalf when they smell like soup and not like secrets, and we sat. She asked careful questions. I answered with dates, names, and sentences that did not apologize for existing. She noted the trust, the filings, the officer's visit, the neighbor footage, and then her pen slowed, hovering over a line halfway down her form, and she looked up and said, "There's something you should know about the original report." And her mouth shaped a name that made my spoon clatter in its saucer, because sometimes betrayal sends its letters through more than one messenger, and this one carried a signature I had not expected to see. Will you stand with me for what she says next, when the person who filed the accusation turns out to be someone I once trusted to braid my hair before church?